There are even some Russian analysts who are wondering whether it will actually still go ahead when we get into that final stage of the preparations to see, what so that the two sides are really going to talk about, whether they might have to, in kind of classic President Trump way, as he does with tariffs, postpone it by 10, 20, 30 days, something like that. I think that's a little bit unlikely at this stage because they seem to have really got deeply into it. But if Witkoff understood in Moscow that the Russians were happy to meet with Zelensky in Alaska, he was deeply mistaken, because the Russians have been really consistent about this. And Putin said quite recently, look, this is not the stage at which I'm going to meet the Ukrainian president.
Hello and welcome to Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. Now, today we're very privileged to be talking to John Lough, and we're in the run-up to this greatly anticipated meeting between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin in Alaska. Now, John is the head of foreign policy at the New Eurasian Strategy Center and a leading Russia and Eurasia expert. He's a former NATO representative who is actually based in Moscow and possesses a rare first-hand experience of engaging directly with the Russian state. John, welcome back to Frontline.
Thank you very much. It's good to be with you.
Now, you've got this experience. Do you think Donald Trump needs your advice? We've got on Friday, both Putin and Trump are due to meet in Alaska. Europe is holding its breath at the potential of the summit. From your perspective, what are the stakes here? This has been put together in record time. Is it a genuine meeting? Are there going to be real outcomes from it?
Well, I think it's important here to manage expectations. This is a very important meeting, and both presidents have wanted it. And for Putin, it's a form of rehabilitation, if you like, since he's been indicted as a war criminal by the International Criminal Court. His country is has been targeted by an unprecedented level of sanctions, and yet he's able to get a meeting with the President of the United States. So that tells us that something has very fundamentally changed since President Trump returned to the White House. Now, in terms of Russia advice, what is Trump getting? He's a man, as we know, who marches on instinct. And he has an instinct about Putin that this is somebody he can work with, that he understands him, that he may indeed even be well disposed towards Trump. This is all apparently in Trump's mind. He's spoken about this confidently on many occasions. But he has, in the case of this meeting, we understand from the Vice President J.D. Vance, an interview at the weekend, that Trump knows that this might not work. So it does seem that he's listened over recent months to both the Europeans and to the Ukrainians once he got his dialogue with President Zelensky going again, and accepted that this is a really very complicated situation, and there are no quick and easy solutions. Whatever Trump says, I think he's learned this can't be done quickly and easily. And it's striking that his special envoy, Steve Witkoff, who was in Moscow last week for his fifth meeting, this is a man who has no background in Russian affairs. He didn't go into that meeting with the US ambassador or any Russia expert, as I understand it. I'm not even sure that he had his own interpreter. But it seems that coming out of that meeting, he may even have misunderstood something that Putin said around possible land swaps, as Witkoff put it. And it seems from trying to sort of disentangle what both sides have been saying, that Putin wasn't talking about land swaps as such. He was talking about the Ukrainians giving up territory in order then to stabilize the front line where Putin would like it. So this is an indication, I think, of the difficulties of sending novices to deal with Putin just because they happen to be Trump's golf buddy in this case. And I'm sure Steve Witkoff must be a very successful real estate developer. He's an extremely wealthy man, apparently. But diplomacy is something relatively new to him. And he's not just been dealing with this portfolio, he's been dealing with the Middle East as well. So I think that just tells you about the sort of degree of improvisation here and amateurism, quite frankly, that the US side is showing. And there seems to be no traditional interagency process underpinning this whole effort, where policy planners would be coordinating the positions of different parts of the government in their understanding of what the Russians are looking for, what their bottom line might be. This is all an improvisation. We don't even have in the United States a full-time national security advisor. Now, Marco Rubio is having to double up as Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, and the National Security Advisor's job is 24/7. So it's not surprising that this process looks on the US side to be, in terms of preparation, pretty threadbare.
Mm-hmm. So you emphasized how Witkoff is not an experienced diplomat. You've worked with the Russians. Do you think that Putin and his team will have been deliberately playing Witkoff and using every tool that they've got in the book? And do you think Putin sees the fact that he's going to Alaska and he's managed to exclude President Zelensky from any meeting that's there as a win for him?
Yeah, it's a big win for him. But I mean, answer your first question, I think the Russians like dealing with people who've just got off the plane and don't know their country, don't know their psychology, don't know how to talk to them, and will just listen to their narratives and not even challenge them. And then they, if somebody does, they then try to catch them out, as famously happened with Liz Truss when she was foreign secretary, went to Moscow, and the Russian foreign minister Sergei Lavrov threw a question at her, which, to answer it, you did need to have some knowledge of the geography of the Russian Federation, and she fell into the trap. That's the sort of thing the Russians do. So, Witkoff for them is an absolute gift, because he has the ear of President Trump, and you can tell him anything, and he'll seemingly absorb it and say, well, the Russians think this, the Russians say that, and President Putin told me that he really wants peace. And then a sort of whole narrative begins around the Russians are seeking a peace settlement. The Russians are seeking to win this war against Ukraine and to impose a Russian peace on Ukraine. And I think we have to sort of brutally clear about that. So I'm rather skeptical about what this meeting can bring, if anything at all. There are even some Russian analysts who are wondering whether it will actually still go ahead when we get into that final stage of the preparations to see, what the two sides are really going to talk about, whether they might have to, in kind of classic President Trump way, as he does with tariffs, postpone it by 10, 20, 30 days, something like that. I think that's a little bit unlikely at this stage, because they seem to have really got deeply into it. But if Witkoff understood in Moscow that the Russians were happy to meet with Zelensky in Alaska, he was deeply mistaken, because the Russians have been really consistent about this. And Putin said quite recently, look, this is not the stage at which I'm going to meet the Ukrainian president. I mean, previously he'd never even entertained the possibility of engaging with Zelensky, calling him a neo-Nazi, claiming that his rule was illegitimate, all these things. But he I think, will only and probably grudgingly sit down with Zelensky when he feels that he's actually resolved the major questions around what Ukraine is going to look like in a post-war scenario. But this is not easy to deliver, because Trump can't do this on his own. The Europeans and the Ukrainians have to ultimately be part of this picture. So it's going to be very interesting to see how far Trump tries to push, because he's got fewer cards now than he had a few months ago, in the sense that he's already signaled that US military supplies, or at least defense equipment and ammunition, weapons, funded by the US, are no longer going to be available to Ukraine. If the Europeans want to buy them, they're welcome to do that, and that is at the moment is important in terms of these Patriot air defense systems. But beyond that, the US supplies intelligence to the Ukrainian side, which Trump cut off briefly. But now, with the Europeans realizing and the Ukrainians realizing that the US is much less of an influential player in the case of Ukraine, I almost have the feeling that Trump has sort of cut some of the ground from under his feet. He's played that card with Zelensky, and it seems that the Europeans can keep the Ukrainians going, for a while yet. We still got some of the stocks from the Biden days sort of left over, even some of that actually unspent. So, Trump sort of threatening Zelensky now, it's not quite as frightening as it was 3 or 4 months ago. But interestingly, he has restored a relationship with Zelensky, and after that Oval Office breakdown, that in itself is rather remarkable. And the first thing that Trump did after getting the summary of the meeting with Witkoff last week was to phone the Ukrainians and the Europeans. So the major European countries, I think with the exception of France, for some reason, were on that call. So I think during this process, Trump has definitely learned something, but he still seems to be relying on the sense that he can somehow persuade Putin, that they can find a common language. And in one respect, he and his team are correct in that Ukraine is not in a position and will not be in a position anytime soon to reconquer the territory that it's lost. It's trying to stem further advances into the country, but it can't stop the Russians at this stage. So if you're looking to try to freeze this conflict, and that's what Trump's goal is, then you've got to say, well, Ukraine, this is probably as good as it's going to get. And we will now see if the Russians will accept some kind of peace formula. And then these other conditions come into play. So alliances, the Russians' insistence on Ukraine's demilitarization, which has been a little bit de-emphasized, interestingly, in recent days, but I'm quite sure it will return. Limits then on the size of Ukraine's armed forces, then elections. We get into a chain of really quite complicated issues. Because at what point can Ukraine hold elections when it's got to lift martial law? To lift martial law, there's got to be a durable peace framework in place.
Well, and elections, how do you carry out elections whenever there's a large part of Ukrainian population as evacuees and diaspora across Europe and other parts of the world? And how do you get the people in the areas that Russia has captured to vote in free and fair elections if the Russians don't allow them to happen? And what is the status of the territories that Russia has declared are now part of federal Russia? Yeah, the complexities are huge when it comes to elections and everything else. Do you think one of the reasons why Putin may be agreeing to this, yes, he's got his political victory and all the rest of it, but do you think he's worried about his ability to continue to sustain the war? We keep hearing of the Russian economy and how difficult that is. The Russians have lost over 1 million people now in the conflict, and it's growing. They seem to be running out of equipment, and their defense industrial base is not keeping up with what is required, hence the heavy reliance on North Korea for the simple things like artillery ammunition. And we're seeing more North Korean equipment coming in. Is Putin worried?
I don't think he's seriously worried. The economists have clearly told him that the country can carry on fighting at this level for a good long while. You're absolutely right about the shortcomings of the defense industry. There seem to be some genuine difficulties there. And the Russians, as you indicate, have made up some of those shortages by turning to the North Koreans. They have been quite successful in building a drone industry. And that's probably one of the, I suppose, highlights of the Russian defense industry over the last sort of couple of years. They've had to rely, I think, quite heavily initially on Iran to do this. Iran had some specific drone technology, these Shahed drones. And then they've also needed components from China. And the Chinese talk peace, but are quite happy to provide these sort of so-called dual-use technologies. So at that level, I think the Russians are kind of okay. They're still burning through vast quantities of equipment that they had in storage after the end of the Cold War. And as you indicate, they've lost a huge number of men, of soldiers, killed and wounded. But the Russian leadership is really indifferent to these losses. And in society, these people who've gone to serve in the army, for the most part, are seen as those who were on the take, who wanted to make money, took the risk, and who ultimately cares. Now, Russian society in that respect, I think, can be very harsh, but there's no sense of a real pushback against this war in any part of society in Russia itself. And outside the country is a sort of different matter. But I think there are a couple of things that Putin still has to reckon with. Firstly, if the army were to push much further into Ukraine, if it were even to achieve a significant breakthrough, to occupy a major city would be a huge undertaking with the human resources they have at the moment. They would have to almost certainly mobilize. and that he doesn't want to do. They had the experience of mobilization in late 2022, and something like 1 million people left the country at the time. Some of those returned, but the majority of them stayed abroad, and it was considered to be really very, very unpopular. So they don't want to go down that route. The other factor, which is underestimated and we don't know enough about, is that there is clearly some dissatisfaction within the elite, generally speaking, including the business elite, with just how long this war is lasting. It's tiring. People seek some sort of normalization of their lives. They want to see sanctions lifted. So the longer it goes on without material gains, at the end of the day, the Russian army is grinding away slowly and painfully, but they haven't captured a major city at this stage. So they held the city of Kherson for a while, but they were then driven out. So there isn't a huge amount to show. However, getting a meeting with Trump, overcoming the country's isolation, having this dialogue that Trump Putin has desired for so long, that is a big win. There's no question about it. So Putin may have bought himself a little bit more time, but he knows full well that Trump isn't going to exert real economic pressure on him. He's not going to risk a spike in the oil price by closing the Danish Straits, constraining Russia's oil exports. He's threatened to put some tariffs on India for buying Russian oil. Whether those will actually really be implemented remains to be seen, given that Trump seemed to want to build a relationship with India. And equally, he doesn't seem to be in too much of a hurry to impose similar measures on China, which is also taking a significant portion of those Russian oil exports. Those exports were previously directed towards Europe, but because of these changes in the oil market as a result of sanctions, the Asian markets had started to take them. And this is where India has really profited, in the sense that it's been able to get a discount on Russian oil as a result. So Western countries are still chipping away at the shadow fleet, making things more difficult for the Russians. But throughout this war, the Russians have shown that they're very nimble when it comes to getting around sanctions. So this idea of Western policymakers at the outset that sanctions would somehow cripple the Russian economy, make Putin come to the table, those proved to be misplaced, because this was no longer the Soviet economy. It's a market economy. It's adaptable. People find ways around things. So for the first few months, there's no question they really did have an impact, and we can see that in the decline of Russian GDP. But the economy adapted really remarkably quickly. So from that perspective, Putin doesn't, I believe, fear Trump. He knows the one thing that could hurt him, Trump won't do. Trump will not arm Ukraine. That's the one thing that would put Putin under real pressure. But Trump is, stuck between his MAGA base and a pretty significant contingent in the US Congress, which believes that Ukraine deserves US support, that NATO is valuable, that the Russians are a threat, all these things. But there isn't a majority there at the moment that's forcing his hand. So he's got a bit of room for maneuver, but it's clear over recent weeks that he's been, I think, frustrated by Putin's lack of readiness to engage. I mean, Trump offered him a great deal a few months ago to end this war, and for some reason Putin didn't want to take it at that point. But it rather feels as though Putin's going to Alaska to sort of get back into Trump's favor. And I suspect he'll do that pretty quickly, because he knows how to talk to Trump. He knows how to flatter him. He can draw on all his skills of manipulating people that he learned as a KGB professional. And we know from their previous dialogues that he seems to have an effect on Trump. I was reminding colleagues of mine this morning that we should think of the 2019 summit that President Trump had with the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, where, a little bit like in the build-up to this meeting with Putin, he thought he could do a great deal. He'd fallen in love with Kim. He thought that denuclearization was something he could agree. And he went into that meeting thinking, I've got a chance of delivering this. But his advisors at the time told him, this really might not work. And he was cognizant of that. And he was prepared to walk away, which is ultimately what he did. But we're back to your question then, of who's actually advising him in this case. And there doesn't seem to be anybody close to Trump, as far as I'm aware, who understands Russia, has deep knowledge of the country, and has Trump's ear. There seems to be some small group that is definitely preparing these talks, and I suspect that there are some competent people there. But to what extent they're listened to by the president, who knows?
Yeah, but you mentioned that Putin feared most Trump arming Ukraine even more. But we keep hearing about the Russian economy, and whilst it's not in free fall at the moment, there are, according to the Russian newspapers over the last few weeks, more and more indicators of things not being completely okay. The number of companies that are failing to pay their wages at the end of every month is going up. New car sales are falling through the floor. The cost of living inside the supermarkets is going up. And that will in itself stir more dissent amongst the Russian people, but also the oligarchs that control all of these major outlets and make their money from it. How critical is this oil market to underpinning Russia's economy? And do you think that China and India, who both turned around and said, we're not bothered by secondary tariffs, bring them on effectively to Donald Trump, throwing the gauntlet down, do you think they may have put pressure onto Vladimir Putin to do anything to delay Donald Trump making this move to imposing secondary tariffs?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean, Putin has supposedly spoken to a number of leaders in Asia, I think including the Chinese and the Indians, since the announcement of the summit. So, he's preparing his ground just as Zelensky's, preparing his by talking to the Europeans. But I don't see any real hope here that the Chinese, for example, are going to put pressure on Putin. I don't think they like this war, but they don't want to see Russia lose it. And they're prepared to, help to some degree. I mean, they're not supplying, I don't believe they're supplying weapons directly, but all those dual-use technologies, those thousands of bulldozers they supplied that helped build the defensive lines at the end of, or the beginning of 2023. And at that point, we've got to remember the Ukrainian army had been advancing spectacularly and had the Russians on the run. And that was probably at the moment where the Russian army actually might have cracked. But that moment was missed, and partly because the Biden administration was fearful of the Ukrainians defeating the Russian army in Ukraine because they thought the war might go nuclear. And this is where I think some of the Russian threat mongering worked extremely well. It seemed to have an effect on President Biden at the time. So equally, I don't think the Indians have a huge say here. I mean, they're obviously shell shocked by these announced tariffs of effectively 50% tariffs that would be placed on their goods. But they still seem, for now, committed to taking Russian oil, although there are some indications that some of I think the Indian buyers or the Indian refineries are looking for alternative sources. But at the end of the day, Trump is not in a position to disrupt the oil market to an extent where there would be a spike in the price that would affect US consumers. So I think that's what he's got to avoid, and Putin knows this full well. In terms of the economy, I think it's worth pointing out that military industry and the sort of revitalization of the defense industry, or the investment in that area, created a sort of mini boom, really after 2023 and up to the beginning of this year. And that looks to be fizzling out. Some of the civilian industries are suffering, and you noted correctly the automobile industry, for example. We've seen factories, having to reduce output in some cases, I think even close. So there are definitely problems there. But within society itself, we have this sort of interesting picture where those people connected with the defense industry are very happy with life because they're largely from regions of the country that didn't previously benefit from such largesse, from Moscow. So in terms of the sort of public opinion picture, and I was talking to a Russian sociologist recently who was explaining to me that at the moment you've got about 25% of the population, and as far as this can be judged, feels sort of happy with the war, feels it's better off as a result. And then you've got another 25% that feels actually its living standards have fallen. And the people in the second category are typically those from the big cities, those people who benefited from the modernization of the economy after Putin came to power in the first 2 decades of this century. So sociologically, something very sort of interesting is happening in Russia at the moment. And if the war comes to an end, there's a question of then how the authorities manage this, because those people who've done well are probably like to do rather less well, because there'll be probably less money going into the defense sector. There'll certainly be money going into other areas, and if the Russians are serious about rebuilding some of these towns and villages in occupied Ukraine, they're going to have their work cut out for a very, very long time. But there are real doubts about whether they've really got the resources to do this.
But do you think if Putin loses, and this could be part of the reason why elements of the West are anxious about Zelensky forcing Putin's hand, if Putin loses and his government collapses, is there a natural government that could come and take over? Is there a natural succession, or is there a danger that the Moscow regime that holds the whole of the Russian Federation together could collapse, and that could have a ripple across the Russian Federation, causing even bigger problems?
Well, that was certainly the concern of the US authorities. Let's say, the end of 2022, beginning of 2023. What happens if the Russians are defeated in Ukraine? But since that time, Putin's been able to turn around the situation, and he is not in danger of losing. There would have to be some extraordinary, black swan event that would change his fortunes. He feels he's on a winning track. And, I was talking to a British official about a year ago, who well acquainted with, what's going on in Ukraine, who said to me, there's actually not much we can do, because the Ukrainians are losing slowly, and that's probably the best we're going to be able to get to. So by that, this person meant, and I don't think they're alone in this assessment, that the Russians were going to continue to move forward. Ukraine had a problem of manpower in its armed forces, had obviously shortages of weaponry, ammunition, all these things. And those have not been fundamentally resolved. So the country is now being attacked much more from the air as a result of the Russians stepping up their use of drone technologies. And so it's more vulnerable. So there is a question of just how long the Ukrainians can carry on for. I tend to think they can go on for a long time. But this is all relative, because the Russians have that greater strength in depth, and it doesn't look at this stage. There are no indications of cracks in the leadership that would create that sort of crisis. We did have one crack with the Prigozhin mutiny back in 2023, when I think Putin was briefly facing a very, very serious problem of his credibility as a leader, with a group of people who were probably more gung-ho than him when it came to the war aims, and accusing him effectively accusing him and of course the military command of incompetence. Then he was in a tough place, and he was starting to panic. And I'd never seen him like that before, when a military headquarters effectively in the south of Russia was occupied by the rebels. But we don't see any indication that something of that kind could return. I'm quite sure if he tries to cut a deal with Trump and maybe steps back from some of his maximalist positions, and let's say, just hypothetically, he didn't insist on annexing all 4 regions in their entirety from Ukraine. He still doesn't control around 25% of 3 of those regions, something like that. Let's say in the case of 2 of them, in Kherson and Zaporizhia, he was prepared to cut a deal. Now, I'm quite sure that in the so-called Z blogger, the sort of patriot community of people who support these war aims and support the reducing Ukraine to a vassal and defeating the West as they see it, I'm quite sure that a constituency there will be unhappy. But that may be, that may just prove to be manageable, and measures can be taken to silence those people because the Russian authorities are more than capable of doing that. So for now, I don't see the scenario that you're painting. I don't see there's any possibility that it could come about. If Putin, however, were to suffer a heart attack or slip on a banana skin tomorrow, then constitutionally, the Prime Minister, Mikhail Mishustin, would assume the reins of power, and there would then have to be elections. But I think the expectation is that if Putin were to suddenly leave the Kremlin or suddenly die, then we would get into a period of some sort of collective leadership, possibly something akin to what happened at the end of the Stalin era. Before then, a new leader emerged. But this is all highly, hypothetical. I think there are many things brewing within the Russian elites and within Russian society that we just do not fully understand at present, because the country has become so repressive. Those of us who study it can't get there, and so we have to accept there are fewer sources of information. There are fewer Russian journalists able to find out things that they can actually write about. And as a result, we have really quite limited knowledge of what's really going on at the center of power.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. Prigozhin, I think, shocked himself as to how far he came in getting up towards Moscow. I don't think he had necessarily anticipated getting as far as he did. But finally, John, looking at Friday, what's one key indicator that you're going to be looking for to say what way the talks are going to go?
I think the key indicator for me will be how long the talks last and what the mood music is when the two leaders come out. And I'm quite sure they'll be doing another mini press conference, just as they did after the Helsinki summit back in 2018, where Trump, I think, just terrified his advisors by showing such flexibility towards Putin, because he was obviously charmed. But this time round, it may be a little bit different. I think Trump, too, in Putin's eyes, is somebody who probably deserves more respect. The fact that he managed to win, a second election, starting from where he did, is nothing really short of extraordinary. So whether Trump's now got the confidence, and having done a trade deal with Europe and in his view ended other conflicts around the world, whether he's going to be up for showing a bit of muscle towards Putin, well, that's anybody's guess. I'm still actually very skeptical on that front. But I don't think it'll be just a repeat of what we saw in Helsinki in 2018, where Trump just seems to cave.
Well, John, your skepticism is good, because that means that we have to get you back again to analyse what has happened after that. It's been a real pleasure talking to you today on Frontline.
Thank you very much, Philip.
You've been watching Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. If you'd like access to exclusive content, please subscribe to Times Radio membership and watch us on YouTube. But you can now get us as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. And don't forget, you can also listen to Times Radio for the latest updates on global affairs and read about them at thetimes.com. Thank you.